I admit I didn't have faith, but John Krasinski really brought it home here. I did not expect this movie to be as much fun as it was. A Quiet Place Part 2 is once again directed by John Krasinski. It stars Millicent Simmons, Emily Blunt, and Noah Jupe, and tells the continuing story of the Abbott family, picking up pretty much exactly where the first film left off and following the remaining Abbotts, Evelyn, Reagan, Marcus, and the baby, out into the unknown reaches of the world as they try and find a new safe haven. I rewatched A Quiet Place last week in preparation for this, and honestly, I was surprised at how well it held up. I was worried that it was going to be the kind of film that only worked because of the theater experience, but I was wrong. Sure, everyone has their nitpicks with it, and some of them are legitimate gripes, but it does hold up really well because it's a solid, emotionally driven character story that gives you a really cool glimpse at a much broader world through a very small window. A Quiet Place Part 2 is a completely different film from its predecessor. It takes the best elements of the first film, the family dynamic and the genuine attachment to these characters, because we know them at this point, and it expands it, giving us a much broader look at the world around them. And for better or worse, that larger scale gave me really strong Last of Us vibes, and I mean that in a very good way. The broader scope really does help with the tension overall. The family's no longer in their safe environment where they're able to control their surroundings and control how much sound they make. Out in the real world, you don't have that kind of control. And there's a lot that can go wrong, and there's a lot that does go wrong. The film kicks off with an extended flashback sequence showing what happened on day one, and it doesn't even really give you time to get situated before it thrusts you into like full tilt chaos, and I loved that. We get the same fantastic sound design as the first time that really helps immerse you in this entire world, shifting between total silence when we're seeing things through Reagan's point of view, to how deafening every little noise sounds when you're trying to be that quiet. It reminds me of a stealth game, and I love stealth games, and that opening 10 minutes or so works so well, and there's a lot of really great handheld camera work, and it puts you right amongst the panic with everybody. One of the first thoughts I had when we get this really cool driving shot was, wow, this would be a really good simulator ride at a theme park, and I had that thought repeatedly throughout this film, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Krasinski really did step his game up between films. He talked a lot about how he did his horror homework, and I can see now that he wasn't just blowing smoke. There are a lot of really cool homages in here, from Jaws to Jurassic Park, and it's accompanied with some really excellent thrill ride action that will have you on the edge of your seat, or at times physically cringing. The creatures get to shine a lot more. The Jaws effect is gone already, so we can kind of just see them in their full glory, and not only is the CGI better, but they look a lot more threatening in just the way they move, in how savage they are. They're not even killing to eat or for nourishment, they're killing purely for sport or because they just don't like sound. And when we're finally thrust back into the present, we don't even get a minute or two to breathe before things kick right back off into the pure chaos of everything that just happened. The nerve-wracking anxiety kicks back into gear immediately, and there's a truly shocking out-of-nowhere moment that made me, wince. It's very well acted, and it's pretty fucking harrowing, so you'll know it when you see it. There are multiple sequences in this film that had my heart in my throat. If I talked about how intense the flooding basement scene was in the first film, it's got nothing on an entire middle section of this film that's 3 sets of horribly anxiety-inducing parallel action intercut perfectly to leave you pretty much on edge for a solid 20-30 minutes. At least that's what it felt like. Where A Quiet Place was very much an emotionally driven character piece centered on this family unit as a whole, Part 2 really gives certain family members time to shine, specifically the 2 kids, Reagan and Marcus. But it's Millicent Simmons as Reagan who really steps up to essentially become the protagonist of this film and this franchise if it continues. Simmons really is the star of this movie. She's a total badass in a way that kind of gives me low-key child Ellen Ripley vibes, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's really cool. It's very nice to see a sort of return to form of these 80s, 90s era action stars, but in this case it's a young deaf girl. I think that's awesome. And Reagan really steps up and accepts that role with grace, and she fills her father's shoes in a big way that had me genuinely welling up at the end of this movie. If you're the kind of person who nitpicks, yeah, you're gonna have the same problems with this one that you did the first one. there are some issues that I had. I mean, the ending does end fairly similarly to the first film. But honestly, the biggest thing that stands out to me is this film makes a point to talk about how the kinds of people who are left are the people who aren't worth saving. And we do get an instance of that in the aforementioned parallel action sequence. And, like, this film's version of, like, these bad people who shouldn't be saved are, like, a bunch of pirates who, I think, they look like pirates, and they looked like they were ripped right out of Pirates of the Caribbean. They don't talk at all, and it's just a weird moment. Like, that scene is intense for other reasons, but that detail was so surreal to me, and I was just like, what is this doing in this movie? Why? Huh? Well, that ultimately is a nitpick, and A Quiet Place Part 2 ends up being a fantastic time. Especially in a movie theater. I think if there's one thing that warrants going to see a film in a movie theater, it's this movie. And I mean, the box office is showing that's clearly the case. If you haven't gotten vaccinated yet, go get vaccinated and then go see this movie, because it's very worth the theater experience, I promise you. I would actually argue it's a bit better than the original. It's certainly more of a thrill ride than the original. And I'm going to say that A Quiet Place Part 2 is a must-see. It's not a perfect film, but it's kind of a perfect sequel, managing to not feel extraneous and to justify its own existence by telling a really cool extension of this story and building this world a lot further. I would actually say it exceeded my expectations.